To begin lacing a tent, the first thing we're going to do is unroll the tent sections, get them out of their bags, and unroll them in the area where we would normally be putting up a tent. Obviously, we're doing this inside today, but we can still demonstrate the general idea of how you lace a tent together. After you get the tent section out of the bag and you get the rope untied, then you want to unroll the first section, which in this case is an end section. And that's typical of putting up a sectional tent. You will always unroll your end section first. Now the guys are going to get the middle section out of the bag. And when they get the bag off the tent, they will actually begin to roll the middle section in the opposite direction that they rolled the end section. Now, if you were to have a two-section tent, like a square tent, then the section that they're working with now would be the other end section to form a square. But it's the same principle whether you have a square tent made of two ends or a rectangular shaped tent which would have two ends and multiple middle sections. Today we're just going to demonstrate how to lace an end section to a middle section since we're working indoors and we're limited on space. The first thing you do after you get your tent sections unrolled is to unfold the sections one fold at a time. Unfolding the section one fold at a time is very important because when you're outside, there's always something underneath the tent like asphalt, concrete, or sticks or stones, which if you drag the heavy folds across those objects, they can put pinholes in the tent. The first section is unfolded, and now Mike and Matthew are going to unfold the second section, or the middle section in this case. Once they have the middle section completely unfolded, then we'll be able to start the demonstration of the lacing sequence for what we call the lace lines. Before the guys actually start lacing the tent, they will straighten out the lace line on the right hand side, the white piece of material, and then the red side, which is the grommet side, they'll straighten them out to line the grommets on both sides up together. This just makes it simpler and easier to lace the tent sections together. You always start the lacing process in the very center of the tent. You start in the center and you work backwards towards the perimeter. Beginning at the center, there's a couple of things that we have to do in preparation for lacing. Mike is taking the long rope that you see there connected to the large metal ring under the tent section, and he's stuffing it back under the tent section. Those are the center pole ropes. Those are what you will use later to tie your tent to the center pole. The smaller ropes that he threw back out of his way are the weather flap ropes. The basic lacing procedure is this. You take the first loop, push it through the first grommet hole, then you take the second loop, go through the second grommet hole, and back up through the first loop. Then you take the third loop, go through the third hole on the grommet line, and back up through the second loop, and so on and so on. You form a chain. Each loop goes through the grommet and then back up towards the center of the tent through the loop that preceded the loop that you have in your hand. You do this over and over. Loop through the grommet, back through the loop through the grommet, and back through the loop. This process continues in the same direction from the center of the tent towards the perimeter of the tent. Now Mike is going to repeat the process on the second side. First loop through the first grommet hole, and when he pulls the loop up through, then he'll take the second loop and go through the grommet on the grommet line and back through the loop again. And then the third loop goes through the third grommet line and back up through the second loop again. You repeat this process over and over until you get to the edge or the perimeter of the tent. Reaching the perimeter, we will reverse the direction that the loops go. Now we've reached the end, and you can see that the next to the last loop is longer than the rest of the loops. You continue the process moving from the center towards the edge until you reach the long loop there that is the next to the last loop. That loop goes through the previous loop in the same direction as normal, But then when you stick the last loop through the last hole, you actually take the long loop and you reverse the pull, the direction of the pull, back towards the center of the tent, and then you tie a double knot using the long loop to tie the knot with. That's why the loop is extra long, so that you can reverse the direction and tie a knot. Here we get to see it again. Reverse the direction and tie the knot using the long loop to form the double knot. Be sure you tie it twice. After tying the knot, right there where Mike's knees are, where the two sections join, there's a large metal snap underneath the tent on one side. On the opposite side, there's a large metal ring. You take the large metal snap and you pull it over and you snap it into the large metal ring. The next step is the weather flap. The weather flap is a flap that covers up the lace line to help prevent leakage on your tent. What you do is you fold the flap over the lace line and you thread the weather flap rope through the series of rings that you find on the weather flap and on the grommet line. The rings are alternating, so you simply thread the rope through the alternating rings and tie it off, pulling all the slack out and tying the rope in the very end of the rope. You want the rope to be loose. You will go back and tighten it later when the tent is up in the air.